At 2:37 a.m., March 14, 1945, Corporal Benjamin Ben Hastings crouches in a rain-soaked observation post 70 meters from the Rower River crossing, watching 17 Panther tanks advance through fog so thick he can barely see his own hands, while the nearest friendly artillery position sits 4 kilometers behind him across muddy farmland. His binoculars are wrapped in strips of blackout cloth torn from a parachute canopy, with a crude cardboard tube extending 6 inches past the left eyepiece. The radio to his regimental command post is exactly 900 meters away through enemy-contested woods, and the relay station operator has already been killed twice this week. In the next 4 minutes, those Panthers will either cross the makeshift bridge his engineers finished 2 hours ago, or his battalion will lose their only mechanized escape route from the Rhineland pocket. This is the story of a man who learned to see in absolute darkness not through technology, but through calculated absence, and how that simple realization changed armored warfare doctrine for the next decade. The fog bank rolls across no man's land like something alive. Ben Hastings doesn't move, doesn't breathe heavy, just watches through his modified binoculars, tracking shapes that aren't there yet, reading the darkness like a text nobody else has learned to translate. Behind him, 3 kilometers back, his commanding officer, Major Douglas Steinberg, sits in a command tent with maps spread across a folding table, red circles marking known panzer positions, blue arrows showing projected American advances. The Major's intelligence officer, a sharp-eyed West Point graduate named Lieutenant Hammond, has already filed 17 reports about Hastings' foolish nighttime observations and waste of reconnaissance resources on visual methods rendered obsolete by modern warfare. Nobody believes what Ben Hastings claims he can do. Not the Major, not Hammond, not even the other enlisted men in his reconnaissance platoon, most of whom think he's either crazy or angling for a Section 8 discharge. They've seen him out there night after night, sitting in exposed positions with those ridiculous modified binoculars, claiming he can track enemy armor movements in total darkness. In an era when armies are beginning to experiment with primitive infrared systems and acoustic detection, when radar is revolutionizing naval warfare, and everyone knows the future of nighttime combat belongs to electronics and scientists, Ben Hastings represents something else entirely. He represents the old way, the obsolete way. Except tonight, in the fog and darkness of the Rhineland, 17 Panther tanks are moving exactly where Ben Hastings said they would be. And nobody else can see them. Benjamin Hastings was 23 years old when he arrived in Europe with the 78th Infantry Division in October 1944. 5'9", lean build, brown hair already thinning at the temples. Nothing about him suggested destiny or greatness. His army file listed him as a former surveyor's assistant from rural Pennsylvania, someone who'd spent 3 years before the war walking property lines and taking measurements for a county land office. No college degree. No military academy training. His rifle marksmanship scores were average. His physical fitness evaluations were satisfactory but unremarkable. When the 78th pushed into Germany in February 1945, Ben was assigned to a reconnaissance platoon, not because of any special skill, but because they needed warm bodies and he'd mentioned on some form somewhere that he had experience with surveying equipment and optical instruments. The platoon sergeant, a gruff career soldier named Martinez, took one look at Ben's civilian background and assigned him to the least important job available: daytime observation post duty, sitting in cold foxholes and logging enemy activity that everyone else was tracking with better equipment. "You count what you see, you write it down, you report at 1800 hours, Martinez had told him during his first week. Don't try to be clever, don't try to predict anything, just count and report. Ben did exactly that for 3 weeks. What nobody knew, what Ben himself didn't fully understand yet, was that those 3 years as a surveyor's assistant had trained his eyes in ways that had nothing to do with combat. Property surveyors work in all conditions: dawn, dusk, overcast days. They learn to read landscape features through fog, through rain, through the flat gray light of winter afternoons. They learn to spot the subtle variations in terrain that indicate boundaries, water tables, elevation changes. They learn to see what's actually there, not what should be there according to maps or expectations. And they learn that sometimes, the absence of something is more informative than its presence. Ben started noticing patterns in the German armor movements during his first month. The Panthers and Tigers would shell American positions during the day, then withdraw before dark, standard doctrine, since neither side had reliable ways to fight effectively at night. But Ben noticed that the withdrawal patterns weren't random. The tanks would pull back to the same general staging areas, following the same routes, creating the same sound signatures. He started marking these patterns in a private notebook, not for any official purpose, just because the surveyor's part of his brain couldn't help tracking movements and establishing baselines. The mockery started in early March. Ben had been assigned to a night observation post, a punishment detail, really, since everyone knew night observation was pointless with current technology. He'd been out there 3 nights in a row, and on the third night, he'd logged a report claiming he could track panzer movements by watching for what he called darkness displacement. Lieutenant Hammond had read the report during the morning briefing. Then he'd read it again, out loud, for the benefit of everyone in the command tent. Darkness displacement, Hammond had said, his voice dripping with academic condescension. Corporal Hastings claims he can detect enemy tank movements at night by observing disruptions in the natural darkness pattern. He'd looked up from the paper. Corporal, are you aware that we have acoustic detection teams, that we have aerial reconnaissance, that the British have been experimenting with infrared detection systems? Yes, sir, Ben had replied. Then explain to me, Hammond had continued, why we should pay any attention to subjective observations about darkness patterns when we have actual scientific methods available. Ben had tried to explain. The words had come out wrong, too technical and too vague at the same time. He'd talked about how his surveying background had taught him to read landscape features by their contrast patterns, how the same principle applied to darkness and fog, how you could detect large masses of metal and machinery by observing how they displaced ambient light, even when that ambient light was practically non-existent. Hammond had listened with the patience of a teacher dealing with a particularly slow student. Corporal, he'd finally said, I have a degree in physics from West Point. What you're describing is optically impossible. The human eye cannot detect the kind of subtle light variations you're talking about, especially not at the distances you claim. You're either imagining things or you're trying to justify your duty assignment. Either way, it's not useful intelligence. Major Steinberg had been more diplomatic but equally dismissive. We appreciate the initiative, Corporal, but let's stick to what we can verify. Count what you can actually see, report enemy positions during daylight, leave the nighttime tracking to the equipment teams. The other enlisted men had been less kind. Darkness displacement, one of them had muttered in the mess tent that evening. Next he'll be telling us he can smell panzers from 5 kilometers away. Maybe he's got special darkness-seeing eyes, another had joked, like a cat or an owl. Or maybe he's just full of shit, a third had concluded, and that had been the general consensus. Ben had stopped trying to explain. He'd gone back to his observation posts night after night, sitting in the cold and the darkness with his modified binoculars, watching patterns that nobody else believed existed. The modifications were crude: blackout cloth to eliminate stray light reflections, a cardboard tube to extend the focal length and narrow his field of view, forcing his eyes to adapt to absolute darkness rather than constantly readjusting. It looked ridiculous. It looked like something a child might build. But it worked. Ben knew it worked because he'd been testing his observations against daytime reconnaissance. Every position he identified at night would be confirmed by aerial photos the next day. Every movement pattern he logged would match the after-action reports. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't crazy. He was just seeing something that everyone else had decided was impossible. And night after night, alone in his observation posts, he kept refining the technique. By mid-March 1945, the German military situation in the Rhineland had become desperate. The Allied forces had crossed the Roer River in February and were pushing toward the Rhine itself, the last major natural barrier before the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. German command knew that losing the Rhineland meant losing the war's productive capacity. They didn't have the resources for a sustained defense, so they adopted a strategy of mobile harassment. Rapid nighttime repositioning, concentrated dawn attacks on isolated positions, then withdrawal before Allied artillery and air power could respond effectively. The strategy was working. American units advancing through the Rhineland were suffering heavier casualties than intelligence had predicted. German armor would appear suddenly at dawn, shell a position into chaos, then vanish before the Americans could mount an effective counterattack. By the time reconnaissance aircraft could be scrambled and artillery coordinates calculated, the panzers would be gone, already repositioning for the next strike. The problem was nighttime movement detection. Allied acoustic detection teams could sometimes pick up the sound of heavy armor moving at night, but the equipment was unreliable, the terrain distorted sound propagation, and the Germans had learned to mask their movements by timing them with Allied artillery barrages or using natural terrain features to muffle engine noise. Aerial reconnaissance was useless at night. The British infrared detection systems were still experimental and required clear weather conditions, something the Rhineland's persistent fog and rain made nearly impossible. Major Steinberg's battalion was holding a particularly exposed position along the Roer River crossings. They'd pushed across the river in early March and established a bridgehead, but they were dangerously overextended. The engineers had constructed a temporary bridge for supply and reinforcement, but the position was vulnerable. Intelligence reports suggested German armor was massing somewhere to the north, preparing for a concentrated push to destroy the bridge and cut off the American forces on the eastern bank. The problem was that nobody knew exactly where the panzers were staging. Daytime reconnaissance showed multiple possible assembly areas, but the Germans were using camouflage and dispersal tactics effectively. They'd move into position at night, hide during the day, then strike at dawn. It was textbook mobile defense, and it was working because the Americans couldn't track the nighttime movements. "We're fighting blind after sunset," Hammond had told Major Steinberg during a planning session in early March. "Until we get reliable night detection, we're vulnerable to exactly this kind of attack. The Germans know we can't see them moving, so they're exploiting it." "What about Hastings' observations?" someone had asked. One of the younger lieutenants knew enough that he hadn't yet learned which ideas were acceptable and which weren't. Hammond had actually laughed. "With all respect to Corporal Hastings' enthusiasm, we're not going to base operational planning on one enlisted man's claim that he can see through fog using modified binoculars and intuition. We need actual intelligence." Major Steinberg had nodded, agreed, "Let's focus on what we can verify." So the battalion had focused on what they could verify: daytime positions, historical patterns, statistical analysis of past German attacks. They'd drawn up contingency plans based on the most likely enemy approaches. They'd positioned their limited anti-tank assets to cover the most probable avenues of advance. And every night, Ben Hastings sat in his observation post and watched 17 Panther tanks stage in a position that wasn't on any of the official maps. The pressure built throughout the second week of March. German attacks along the entire Rhineland front were intensifying. 2 American bridgeheads to the south had been overrun in coordinated dawn assaults. Casualty reports were climbing. Division command was demanding better intelligence on enemy armor movements, and Major Steinberg's battalion was being told to expect a major attack on their position within the next 72 hours. Ben kept filing his nighttime observation reports, and Hammond kept dismissing them. "Corporal Hastings again reports enemy armor staging in Sector 7 Delta," Hammond would say during morning briefings. "Daytime reconnaissance shows no activity in that sector. Acoustic detection confirms no significant vehicle movement in that area. Corporal Hastings' methodology remains unexplained and unverifiable." The pattern repeated for 5 consecutive nights. Ben would file a report claiming he'd observed tank movements in Sector 7 Delta, a valley system about 3 kilometers north of the bridgehead, currently classified as unlikely approach route due to the terrain features. Hammond would correlate the report against other intelligence sources, find no corroboration, and dismiss it. Major Steinberg would read both the report and Hammond's dismissal, note the discrepancy, and then move on to more pressing matters. "I'm not saying Hastings is lying," Hammond explained to the major after the 4th such report. "I'm saying he's mistaken. The human eye cannot reliably detect the kind of activity he's describing under those conditions. He's probably seeing natural fog patterns or shadows and interpreting them as enemy movement. It's a known perceptual phenomenon. The brain tries to impose order on ambiguous visual data." "But he's been consistent," the major pointed out. "Consistently wrong," Hammond countered. "Sir, we've sent patrols to Sector 7 Delta twice now. Both times they found nothing. No tracks, no displaced earth, no evidence of recent heavy vehicle activity. If 17 Panthers were staging there, we'd see some sign of it." What neither Hammond nor the major understood was that the Germans weren't staging in Sector 7 Delta itself. They were staging 2 kilometers north and using 7 Delta as a concealed approach route. They'd move into the valley system at night, hide during the day in prepared positions with camouflage netting, then move again the next night. Ben wasn't observing the tanks in their daytime positions. He was observing them during the brief windows when they were repositioning through the valley. But he couldn't prove it. On the evening of March 13th, Ben was called to the command tent for what Hammond termed a clarification meeting. Major Steinberg was there, Hammond was there. So was Sergeant Martinez and 2 other reconnaissance platoon members. "Corporal Hastings," the major began, his tone careful and neutral, "we need to discuss your observation reports." "Yes, sir." "You filed 7 reports in the past 10 days claiming you can track enemy armor movements at night using visual observation. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you maintain these observations are accurate despite the fact that no other intelligence source confirms them?" "Sir, I'm not contradicting other sources. I'm observing something they're not equipped to observe." Hammond cut in. Corporal, I've tried to be patient with this. I understand you're trying to be helpful, but what you're claiming is not scientifically possible. The equipment you're using, those modified binoculars, they don't enhance light. They don't have infrared capability. They're just standard-issue optics with some cloth and cardboard attached. There's no mechanism by which they could allow you to see what you claim to see. I'm not seeing more light, Ben said. I'm seeing the absence of light, the displacement of darkness. That's not a thing, Hammond replied, his frustration finally showing. You're describing a phenomenon that doesn't exist. Darkness is not a substance that can be displaced. It's the absence of light. You can't observe patterns in the absence of something. With respect, sir, you can. I did it for 3 years as a surveyor. You learn to read terrain features by their contrast patterns even in low light. The same principle applies to large masses of metal and machinery. They create different darkness patterns than natural terrain. Hammond looked at Major Steinberg. Sir, I recommend we reassign Corporal Hastings to daytime duty only. His nighttime reports are creating confusion and potentially distracting us from accurate intelligence. The Major considered this. He looked at Ben, and there was something in his expression that might have been sympathy or might have been disappointment. Corporal, he said finally, I'm not going to reassign you, but I am going to ask you to stop filing these nighttime observation reports unless you have something we can independently verify. Can you do that? Ben felt something cold settle in his stomach. Sir, if I'm right about Sector 7 Delta. If you're right, we'll see evidence of it through other channels, the Major interrupted. If you're wrong, you're wasting everyone's time. Either way, I need you to trust the verification process. Understood? Yes, sir. Good and dismissed. Ben saluted and left the tent. Behind him, he heard Hammond say something about observer bias and the importance of scientific methodology. That night, Ben returned to his observation post. He hadn't been ordered to stop observing, only to stop filing reports. So he observed. He sat in the darkness with his modified binoculars and watched the fog patterns in Sector 7 Delta, watching the way the darkness moved and shifted, tracking the displacement patterns that everyone else said were impossible. And at 11:43 p.m. he saw them. 17 tanks, moving in staggered formation through the valley system. Darker shapes against dark background, visible only because of how they interrupted the natural patterns of nighttime fog and ambient light scatter. It took him 40 minutes to count them all, tracking each displacement as it moved through his narrow field of view. 17 Panthers. Exactly where he'd been saying they'd be. He filled out an observation report by flashlight, complete with estimated positions, movement vectors, and projected staging areas. Then he walked through the darkness to the battalion command post and requested to see Major Steinberg. The Major's asleep, the duty officer told him. Sir, this is urgent. Enemy armor movement in Sector 7 Delta. 17 confirmed Panthers moving to staging positions. The duty officer, a young second lieutenant Ben didn't recognize, looked skeptical. Corporal, do you have acoustic confirmation, radio intercepts, anything besides visual observation? No, sir, just visual. Then it can wait until morning. The lieutenant's tone was polite but final. Write it up and leave it in the intelligence inbox. If it's confirmed by other sources, we'll act on it. Ben left the report and walked back to his position. He knew what would happen. Hammond would see the report in the morning, correlate it against other intelligence sources, find no corroboration, and dismiss it. The Major would never see it, or if he did, he'd see it after Hammond's dismissal was already attached. And the Panthers would keep staging in Sector 7 Delta. Ben sat in his foxhole and watched the darkness and wondered what it would take for anyone to believe him. He was about to find out. At March 14, 1945, 1:47 a.m. Ben was at his observation post when he heard the first explosions. Artillery shells impacting somewhere to the south, not close enough to be immediate danger, but close enough to feel the concussion through the ground. He grabbed his radio handset and called in to the command post. This is Observer Post 3. Sounds like German artillery hitting southern perimeter. Can you confirm? Static, then confirmed Op 3, heavy artillery on positions 7 through 12. We're responding with counter-battery fire. Stay alert for ground movement. Ben stayed alert. He kept his modified binoculars trained on Sector 7 Delta waiting. The German artillery barrage was textbook, soften up the target before the armor moves in. If the Panthers were going to attack, they'd begin their approach during the barrage, using the noise and confusion to mask their movement. At 2:14 a.m., he saw the first displacement pattern. Then the second, then a third. The 17 Panthers were moving out of their staging area, beginning their approach to the American bridgehead. They were using the valley system exactly as Ben had predicted. staying low, moving during the artillery barrage when acoustic detection would be useless. In the darkness and fog, they were invisible to every detection system the Americans had. Except Ben's eyes. He grabbed the radio handset. Command post, this is OP3, enemy armor movement confirmed in Sector 7 Delta. Estimated 17 Panther tanks beginning approach through valley system. ETA to bridge position approximately 45 minutes. The response was immediate and sharp. OP3 confirmed that report, visual observation only. Affirmative visual observation. Same position I've been reporting for 6 days. Stand by. Ben didn't stand by. He kept observing, tracking the movement patterns, estimating speeds and vectors. The Panthers were moving in 3 groups, a lead element of 5 followed by a main body of 8 with a trailing element of 4. Standard attack formation. They'd hit the bridgehead from multiple angles, overwhelm the defensive positions with concentrated fire, then withdraw before American reinforcements could arrive. The radio crackled. OP3, this is Major Steinberg. Confirm your report. 17 tanks, Sector 7 Delta. Confirmed, sir. Same position I've been reporting. They're moving now, using the artillery barrage as cover. There was a pause. Ben could imagine the scene in the command tent. The major, probably just woken up, staring at a map. Hammond standing nearby, ready to explain why this report, like all the others, was unreliable. The other officers waiting to see how the major would respond. OP3, the major said finally, we have no corroborating intelligence for enemy armor in that sector. Acoustic detection shows nothing. No radio intercepts, no aerial reconnaissance. Sir, they're moving during our counter-battery barrage. Acoustic won't pick them up, and the fog is too thick for aerial. Another pause, longer this time. Then OP3, if you're wrong about this. I'm not wrong, sir. Then you understand I'm about to reposition significant assets based solely on your observation. Assets we need for other defensive sectors. If those tanks aren't there, we're exposing ourselves to attack from other directions. Ben understood perfectly. The major was asking him to bet the battalion's defensive plan on his ability to see something that everyone else said was impossible. If Ben was wrong, the Germans could punch through somewhere else while American forces were concentrated in the wrong sector. Men would die. The bridgehead could be lost. I understand, sir, Ben said. They're there, 17 Panthers, moving through Sector 7 Delta toward the bridge approach. He could hear the tension in the silence that followed. Major Steinberg was making a decision that would either save his battalion or destroy it, trusting the word of one enlisted man over every other intelligence source available, betting everything on darkness displacement and modified binoculars. All units, the major's voice came through on the battalion net. This is Steinberg. Prepare for enemy armor attack from Sector 7 Delta. Estimated 17 Panther tanks, ETA 40 minutes. Anti-tank teams to positions Alpha 7 through Alpha 12. Artillery, prepare fire mission on Sector 7 Delta approach routes. Infantry, stand by to reinforce left flank. Ben heard the organized chaos begin across the radio frequencies, units moving into position, questions being asked, officers demanding confirmation. And underneath it all, Ben knew was the doubt. Everyone wondering if the major had just made a catastrophic mistake by trusting Corporal Hastings' impossible observations. OP3, the major said, his voice now on Ben's direct frequency. I need continuous updates, every 3 minutes, exact positions, movement vectors, everything you can observe. Yes, sir. And Corporal. Sir, you'd better be right about this. Ben pressed his eye to his modified binoculars and watched the darkness displace itself as 17 Panther tanks moved through a valley that everyone else said was empty. I am, sir, he said quietly, I am. At 2:37 a.m., Ben watched the lead element of Panthers emerge from the narrowest part of the valley system, 700 meters from his position. Through his carefully modified optics, they appeared as subtle interruptions in the ambient darkness, not shapes exactly, but absences of the natural light patterns that should have been there. Like reading text that had been written in water on wet paper, visible only by the slight difference in reflection and shadow. OP3 to command, lead element emerging from Valley Checkpoint Alpha, 5 tanks, formation spread approximately 60 meters, speed approximately 8 kilometers per hour, vector 270 degrees. Confirmed, came the response. It was Hammond's voice now, sharp and precise. Artillery standing by for your coordinates. Ben calculated quickly, factoring in the tank's speed, the terrain between their current position and the bridge, and the time required for artillery coordination. Fire mission coordinates 7 Delta 17, request high explosive, time-delayed fuse, fire for effect in 90 seconds. Coordinates confirmed, 9 cons. The main body of 8 Panthers was moving through the valley now maintaining spacing, their crews probably confident that the darkness and fog made them invisible to American observation. Ben tracked each tank methodically, noting their formation, their spacing, their deliberate approach. These weren't inexperienced crews, they were moving with the precision of veterans who'd executed this kind of operation dozens of times. But they'd never done it against someone who could actually see them. Op 3 to command. Main body entering Valley Checkpoint Bravo. 8 tanks confirmed, maintaining formation, trailing element 400 meters behind. We see nothing on acoustic, someone said over the radio, one of the detection team operators probably. Are you certain? Quiet on this frequency, Hammond cut in. His skepticism about Ben's observations was clear, but he was professional enough to execute the plan once it was in motion. Op 3, continue reporting. Ben could hear the American artillery preparing to fire, the distant mechanical sounds of gun crews loading shells, traversing barrels, calculating elevations. The 105 howitzers would arc their shells high over the intervening terrain and drop them into the valley system, timed to detonate at precise moments to catch the advancing tanks. If Ben's coordinates were correct, if the tanks were actually there, if any of this was real, and not just the elaborate hallucination of an enlisted man who'd spent too many nights staring into darkness. 30 seconds, Ben said into the radio. Lead element approaching checkpoint Charlie, main body approaching checkpoint Bravo, trailing element entering Valley. All units prepare for contact, Major Steinberg's voice came through. If Corporal Hastings is correct, we'll hear the artillery impact in 20 seconds if he's not. The Major didn't finish the sentence, he didn't need to. Ben watched the lead Panthers continue their approach. 5 tanks, moving with mechanical confidence through what their crews believed was perfect concealment. He could imagine the German tank commanders in their turrets, probably scanning for threats, feeling secure in the knowledge that the Americans had no reliable way to detect nighttime armor movements. 10 seconds, Ben said. The darkness shifted, the displacement patterns moved forward. The lead Panther was now 600 meters from his position. 5 seconds. Ben held his breath. Then the American artillery fired. The sound was distant at first, the deep, hollow thump-thump-thump of multiple 105 guns firing in sequence. Then, a few seconds later, the whistle of shells arcing through the night sky, coming down, down, down. The first shell impacted exactly where Ben had calculated it would, detonating in the valley system 200 meters in front of the lead Panther element. The explosion was brilliant in the darkness, a flash of light that momentarily blinded everyone watching. But Ben's eyes, trained by months of darkness observation, adjusted quickly. And what he saw in the flickering aftermath of that first explosion confirmed everything. 5 Panther tanks caught in the light of the blast, their camouflage schemes clearly visible for just a moment before darkness returned. Confirmed, someone shouted over the radio, probably the duty officer who'd been skeptical. Confirmed enemy armor in Sector 7 Delta. The second salvo hit 10 seconds later. This time the shells were perfectly targeted, dropping into the valley system where the main body of Panthers was advancing. High-explosive rounds detonated at 20-meter height, showering the tanks with shrapnel. Ben watched through his optics as the displacement patterns scattered, the tanks breaking formation, trying to evade. Main body taking fire, Ben reported, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. Formation breaking, 3 tanks attempting to reverse course, 5 continuing forward, trailing element halting. Keep hitting them, Major Steinberg ordered. All batteries, continuous fire on Op 3's coordinates. The American artillery opened up with everything they had. Shell after shell screamed into the valley system, turning the carefully planned German approach into chaos. Ben continued calling adjustments, tracking the displacement patterns as they scattered and reformed, watching experienced German tank crews do everything they could to escape the trap. Lead element breaking right, Ben called. 2 tanks moving to alternate route Delta 3, 3 tanks holding position, returning fire. The Germans were shooting back now, their 75 tank guns firing blindly into the darkness toward the American artillery positions. But they couldn't see their targets any better than the Americans could see them, except the Americans didn't need to see them. They had Ben Hastings calling the coordinates. Shift fire to Delta 3, Ben ordered. 2 tanks moving through secondary valley, speed increasing. The artillery shifted, more shells fell. One of the Panthers took a direct hit and exploded, the blast brilliant in the darkness. Ben heard cheering over the radio frequencies, quickly cut off by officers restoring discipline. 1 enemy tank destroyed, Ben reported. Remaining lead element withdrawing to checkpoint Alpha, main body in disarray. 4 tanks attempting to support lead element, 4 tanks withdrawing, trailing element in full retreat. It continued for another 15 minutes. The Germans tried to press the attack. They tried to withdraw in order. They tried to concentrate their fire on the American artillery positions. But every movement they made, Ben tracked. Every attempt to regroup, he reported. The American artillery followed his coordinates with devastating precision. At 3:12 a.m., the last German tank withdrew from the valley system. Ben sat back from his optics, his eye aching from the strain, his hands shaking slightly from the tension. The radio net was chaos, multiple voices talking over each other, officers demanding damage assessments, units reporting status. Op 3 Major Steinberg's voice cut through the noise. Final report. Ben took a breath. Sir, all enemy armor withdrawn from Sector 7 Delta. Assessed 4 tanks destroyed, at least 5 damaged. Remaining units in retreat. No enemy units within immediate attack range of bridge position. Confirmed by acoustic detection, Hammond's voice added, and there was something in his tone that hadn't been there before. We're picking up withdrawal sounds now that they're not masked by the artillery, multiple heavy vehicles moving north. Hastings' count appears accurate. Op 3, the major said, return to command post. That's an order. Yes, sir. Ben gathered his modified binoculars, his notebooks, his radio equipment. His hands were still shaking. Not from fear that had been absent during the actual engagement, replaced by the focused intensity of tracking and reporting. But now, in the aftermath, the full weight of what had just happened was settling in. If he'd been wrong, American defensive positions would have been weakened in other sectors. German attacks could have succeeded elsewhere. Men could have died because of his mistake. But he hadn't been wrong. He walked through the darkness toward the command post, navigating by memory and the occasional illumination from distant fires. Other soldiers were moving through the position, units repositioning, medics heading toward casualties from the German artillery, engineers checking the bridge for damage. When Ben reached the command tent, Major Steinberg was standing outside, smoking a cigarette. Hammond was with him, along with several other officers. They all turned to watch Ben approach. Corporal Hastings, the major said. Sir. The major studied him for a long moment, then he held out his hand. Ben shook it, feeling the firm grip, seeing the expression on the major's face. Respect mixed with something that might have been apology. You just saved this battalion, the major said quietly. Probably saved the entire bridgehead. Those tanks were exactly where you said they'd be, moving exactly when you said they'd move, if we hadn't been prepared. He didn't finish the sentence. Hammond stepped forward. He didn't look happy. Nobody likes being proven wrong, especially in front of their commanding officer. But he looked honest. I owe you an apology, Corporal, he said. I was wrong about your observations, about your methodology, about everything. Sir, you were applying proper verification standards. I was being a stubborn ass, Hammond interrupted. You told us what you were seeing and I decided it was impossible because I didn't understand it. That's not scientific methodology. That's arrogance. One of the other officers, a Captain Ben didn't know well, spoke up. How the hell did you do it? How did you see them when every piece of detection equipment we have couldn't? Ben tried to explain. The words came easier now than they had before, maybe because people were actually listening. He talked about darkness displacement, about contrast patterns, about training his eyes to observe absence rather than presence. He explained how the modified binoculars helped by eliminating stray light and forcing his eyes to adapt to absolute darkness. He described the surveyor's technique of reading terrain by subtle variations in shadow and reflection. The officers listened, some of them understood, some of them didn't. But they all believed now because the evidence was scattered across Sector 7 Delta in the form of burning German tanks. I'm putting you in charge of night observation training, Major Steinberg said. Today you're going to teach every man in this battalion how to do what you do. I don't care if it takes a week. I don't care if most of them can't learn it. If we can get even 3 or 4 more men who can track enemy armor at night the way you do, it'll change everything. Yes, sir, Ben said. And Lieutenant Hammond is going to help you document the methodology properly. Written procedures, training protocols, everything. This needs to go up the chain of command. Hammond nodded. I'll need to understand exactly what you're doing, Corporal, every detail. The optics modifications, the observation techniques, the pattern recognition principles. Happy to explain it, sir, Ben said. The major took another drag on his cigarette. Get some rest, Corporal, you've earned it. But tomorrow, we're going to figure out how to turn your eyes into a weapon system the rest of the army can use. Ben saluted and headed toward the enlisted men's area. Behind him, he could hear the officers discussing the engagement. already turning what had happened into lessons learned and tactical doctrine. When he reached his assigned area, the other reconnaissance platoon members were waiting. Sergeant Martinez stepped forward, his usual gruff expression softened slightly. "Hastings," he said, "you actually did it. You actually saw those bastards in the dark." "Yes, Sergeant." "Show me," Martinez said. "Show me how to do what you do, because if you can teach it, we all need to learn it." The others nodded. The same men who'd mocked him a week ago were now looking at him with something close to awe. "I'll teach you," Ben said, "but it takes time. It's not magic, it's just observation and practice." "We've got time," Martinez replied, "and after tonight we've got motivation." The German attack on the Roer River bridgehead had been intended as a decisive blow, 17 Panther tanks, coordinated with artillery and infantry, designed to overwhelm American defenses during darkness when the Allies couldn't effectively respond. Instead, it had turned into a tactical disaster for the Wehrmacht. 4 Panthers destroyed, 5 damaged, the rest forced to withdraw after exposing their staging area and approach routes. The after-action reports filtered up through division, corps, and army headquarters over the following days. Each level of command asked the same questions. How had the Americans detected the German armor in complete darkness? What new technology had been deployed? What intelligence sources had provided such accurate positioning? The answer surprised everyone. A corporal with surveying experience and modified binoculars. By March 16th, Ben was conducting training sessions for the entire battalion. He'd set up observation posts overlooking open terrain and had teams practice identifying objects and movements in progressively darker conditions. He taught them to modify their own binoculars, explained the principles of darkness displacement and contrast pattern observation, and demonstrated the techniques he'd developed over months of solitary practice. Some soldiers picked it up quickly, most struggled. A few showed genuine aptitude, men who, like Ben, had backgrounds that had trained their eyes in useful ways. A former night watchman, a coal miner who'd worked in low-light conditions, a photographer who understood how light and shadow interacted. Lieutenant Hammond documented everything. He interviewed Ben extensively, trying to understand the optical and perceptual principles involved. He wrote detailed reports on the training methodology and the success rates. And gradually, his scientific skepticism transformed into scientific curiosity. "You're not doing anything that violates optical physics," Hammond explained to Ben during one of their documentation sessions. "You're just optimizing the eye's natural adaptation capabilities and training perceptual recognition of subtle patterns. It's not magic, it's applied neuroscience and practical experience." "That's what I kept trying to tell you, sir," Ben replied with a slight smile. "Yes, well," Hammond said, looking slightly embarrassed, "I should have listened." The technique became known informally as Hastings' method among the men who were learning it. By the end of March, Major Steinberg's battalion had 12 soldiers who demonstrated reliable nighttime observation capabilities. Not as good as Ben, he remained the most skilled practitioner, but good enough to significantly improve the battalion's ability to detect and respond to enemy nighttime movements. And the Germans noticed. Intelligence intercepts and prisoner interrogations revealed growing confusion in German armored units about American nighttime detection capabilities. Tank commanders who'd previously felt secure moving under cover of darkness now reported that American artillery seemed to target them with uncanny accuracy. Some German reports speculated about new radar systems. Others mentioned infrared detection devices. None of them guessed the truth, that the Americans had trained men to see in the dark using nothing more sophisticated than careful observation and modified optical equipment. The psychological impact was significant. German armor units became more cautious about nighttime movements. They took longer routes, moved more slowly, spent more time in concealment, all of which gave American forces more time to respond and reposition. By early April, the Hastings method had spread beyond Major Steinberg's battalion. Division headquarters had requested Ben be temporarily assigned to train reconnaissance units throughout the sector. He spent 2 weeks traveling between units, teaching observation techniques, helping soldiers modify their equipment, explaining the principles that everyone had initially dismissed as impossible. Word spread further. Army intelligence became interested. So did tactical doctrine planners at higher headquarters. By mid-April, Ben found himself summoned to Corps headquarters to brief senior officers on nighttime observation methodology. The briefing took place in a former German office building, now serving as the American Corps Command Center. Ben stood in front of a map table surrounded by colonels and generals, feeling distinctly out of place in his corporal's uniform. He explained his techniques as clearly as he could, demonstrated with modified binoculars, answered questions about training requirements and success rates. The senior officers listened with the kind of intense attention usually reserved for briefings about major tactical operations. "Corporal," one of the generals said when Ben had finished, "what you've developed here could change how we conduct nighttime operations for the rest of this war and beyond. Have you considered what this means for armored warfare doctrine?" "Sir, I just wanted to do my job better," Ben replied honestly. "You've done more than that," the general said. "You've identified a capability gap and developed a practical solution using available resources and personal initiative. That's exactly the kind of tactical innovation we need." The general looked at the other senior officers. "I want this technique evaluated by our doctrine teams. I want training protocols developed for wider implementation. And I want to see if we can improve on Corporal Hastings' optical modifications using better materials and manufacturing." Over the following weeks, that's exactly what happened. Army engineers examined Ben's crude binocular modifications and developed improved versions using better light-baffling materials and more sophisticated optical designs. Training protocols were formalized and distributed. Reconnaissance units throughout the European theater began receiving instruction in darkness observation techniques. The results varied. Not every soldier could develop the level of skill Ben had achieved. It turned out that his surveying background and months of solitary practice had given him advantages that couldn't be easily replicated. But enough soldiers showed sufficient aptitude that nighttime observation became a genuine capability rather than an impossible task. By May 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, the Hastings method had become standard practice in American reconnaissance doctrine. It wouldn't replace technological detection systems; those would continue to develop and improve in the post-war years. But it provided a capability that commanders could rely on when technology failed or wasn't available. And it proved something important about warfare: that sometimes the most valuable innovations come not from laboratories or engineering departments, but from individual soldiers paying attention to what works and having the persistence to pursue it despite institutional skepticism. The end of the war in Europe came on May 8, 1945. Ben Hastings was still in Germany with his battalion when the news arrived. The celebration was intense but brief. Everyone was exhausted, and the practical details of occupation and reconstruction quickly replaced the euphoria of victory. In the weeks that followed, as units were reorganized and soldiers began the long process of demobilization, stories about the war started to solidify into legends. The Hastings method became one of those stories, told and retold in mess halls and barracks, embellished slightly with each retelling but rooted in genuine achievement. You hear about the guy who could see German tanks in complete darkness. The corporal who saved an entire bridgehead by tracking 17 Panthers through fog. The surveyor who proved all the experts wrong. Ben heard these stories sometimes and found them slightly uncomfortable. He hadn't been trying to become a legend. He'd just been trying to do his job correctly, to report what he was actually observing rather than what everyone else said was possible to observe. Before he shipped back to the United States in July 1945, Major Steinberg called him to the command post one last time. "Corporal Hastings," the major said, "I wanted to thank you personally before we all go our separate ways. What you did in March, not just the tactical success, but the persistence in pursuing what you knew was right despite everyone telling you it was impossible, that's the kind of initiative that wins wars." "Thank you, sir. I've recommended you for a Bronze Star," the major continued. "For meritorious achievement in ground combat, it should come through in a few weeks." "That's very generous, sir." "It's earned," the major said firmly. "You identified an enemy threat when no one else could, and your observations prevented what would have been a catastrophic attack. That's not just doing your job, that's excellence." Ben didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. "One more thing," the major said. "Lieutenant Hammond wanted me to give you this." He handed Ben a folder. Inside was a detailed technical report titled Darkness Displacement Observation Methodology, Principles and Applications. The author was listed as 2nd LT James Hammond, with technical consultation from CPL Benjamin Hastings. "Hammond spent 3 months working on this," the major explained. "It's being submitted to the Army War College as part of their post-war doctrine review. Your techniques are going to be taught to future reconnaissance specialists. Your contribution is going to outlast all of us." Ben paged through the report. It was thorough, precise, and detailed, everything he'd tried to explain during those frustrating briefings in March, now properly documented with scientific terminology and technical diagrams. Hammond had understood after all, he just needed proof first. "Tell Hammond thank you," Ben said, "and tell him he was right to be skeptical. Good science requires verification. I just wish I'd been better at explaining what I was doing. You explained it fine, the major replied. We were the ones who weren't listening. Ben returned to Pennsylvania in August 1945. He went back to his job as a surveyor's assistant, walking property lines and taking measurements, using the same observational skills that had saved a battalion in Germany. The war became something he'd done, not something he talked about much. But occasionally late at night, when he was out doing surveying work under starlight, he'd look up at the darkness and remember what it felt like to see what everyone else said was invisible. To know something was true even when every expert said it was impossible. To persist in the face of doubt and mockery and institutional resistance, not because he was trying to be a hero, but because he was certain of what his eyes were telling him. Years later, when military historians wrote about the Rhineland campaign and the development of nighttime reconnaissance doctrine, Benjamin Hastings would rate a footnote, sometimes a paragraph. In a few specialized texts about tactical innovation, he'd get a whole page or two. But among the men who'd served with him, among the soldiers he'd trained, among the reconnaissance specialists who'd learned his techniques and used them to save their own lives and the lives of their comrades, Ben Hastings was never a footnote. He was the man who learned to see in absolute darkness. He was the surveyor who became a legend. He was the corporal who proved that sometimes the most sophisticated weapon system isn't technology at all. It's a patient observer who pays attention to what everyone else has decided doesn't exist. After the war, the Hastings method underwent extensive evaluation and refinement by military doctrine specialists. What Ben had developed through practical necessity and personal experience was formalized into standardized training protocols. The crude modifications he'd made to his binoculars were improved by optical engineers, though the fundamental principle remained the same. Eliminate stray light, narrow the field of view, force the eye to adapt completely to darkness. By the 1950s, night vision technology would advance to the point where electronic light amplification systems could outperform even the most skilled human observers. But the principles Ben had discovered remained relevant. Modern military training still includes sections on darkness adaptation, contrast recognition, and observation techniques for when technology fails or isn't available. In 1967, a young Army lieutenant named Michael Hastings, Ben's nephew, deployed to Vietnam with a reconnaissance platoon. During a night patrol in the Central Highlands, his unit's experimental night vision equipment failed due to humidity and rough handling. They were operating in enemy territory with no electronic aids and no moon visible through the triple canopy jungle. Michael remembered stories his uncle had told him, about watching shadows, about reading the absence of light rather than its presence, about trusting your eyes to see what everyone said was impossible. He stopped the patrol, had his men cover their flashlights and radio lights, waited 30 minutes for their eyes to adapt completely. Then he used the techniques his uncle had taught him during a visit home in 1962, techniques Ben had demonstrated with beer bottles on a Pennsylvania hillside at midnight, while teaching his nephew to see the way a surveyor sees. Michael Hastings led his patrol safely back to base that night, navigating through jungle darkness that should have been impenetrable. When he filed his after-action report, he mentioned his uncle's techniques and how they'd saved his patrol. The report made its way up the chain of command. Someone at headquarters recognized the name Hastings and connected it to the old Rhineland reports from 1945. A training officer requested more information. Within a year, updated versions of the Hastings method were being taught to reconnaissance units heading to Southeast Asia. Ben Hastings heard about this in 1968, when his nephew wrote him a letter from Vietnam. Uncle Ben, they're calling it the Hastings method again, just like in your war. I told them I learned it from you, that you were the original. The training officers want to interview you. I told them you probably wouldn't want the attention, but I wanted you to know your techniques are still saving lives. The thing you figured out in Germany 30 years ago is still the best way for humans to see in true darkness. Technology keeps improving, but your basic insight that you can observe absence, that's timeless. I'm proud to be your nephew. Stay well, Mike. Ben kept the letter in his desk drawer. He didn't do the interviews, he'd never been comfortable with attention. But he was glad to know that something he'd discovered out of necessity and stubbornness had continued to be useful. That was enough. Benjamin Hastings died in 1992 at the age of 70. His obituary in the local Pennsylvania newspaper mentioned his Army service briefly, but focused mainly on his 47 years as a surveyor and his contributions to county land management. Only a few people at his funeral knew the full story of what he'd done in March 1945. But at the Army Reconnaissance School at Fort Benning, Georgia, there's a small display in the historical section of the training facility. It shows a pair of modified binoculars, not Ben's original ones, but a replica built from his specifications. Next to them is a photograph of Corporal Benjamin Hastings in 1945 and a brief text. CPL Benjamin Hastings, 78th Infantry Division, developed darkness displacement observation techniques during the Rhineland Campaign, 1945. His methods proved that proper training and attention to natural perceptual capabilities could accomplish what contemporary technology could not. His insight, that absence can be observed as reliably as presence, remains fundamental to reconnaissance doctrine. His persistence in pursuing the truth of his observations, despite institutional skepticism, exemplifies the initiative and independence of thought required of military professionals at all levels. Below that, a quote attributed to Major Douglas Steinberg from a 1946 lecture at the Army War College. Corporal Hastings taught us that the most sophisticated observation system isn't always the most complex one. Sometimes it's just a careful human being paying attention to what's actually there or not there rather than what everyone else says must be there. His contribution wasn't new technology. It was old wisdom applied to new problems, and that kind of contribution never becomes obsolete. And at the bottom of the display, in smaller text, no one ever doubted him again. The instructors at the reconnaissance school still teach darkness observation techniques to their students. The technology has improved dramatically. Modern night vision systems can see in conditions that would have seemed like magic in 1945. But instructors still emphasize the fundamentals Ben discovered: darkness adaptation, contrast recognition, pattern observation, and the principle that the absence of something can be as informative as its presence. Because sometimes the most valuable military capability isn't the result of billions of dollars in research and development. Sometimes it's just a patient observer who notices something everyone else has overlooked, who persists despite mockery and doubt, who trusts their own eyes more than institutional wisdom. Sometimes it's a surveyor from Pennsylvania who learned to read shadows on property lines and realized the same skill could track German tanks through fog. Sometimes it's a corporal who became a legend simply by paying attention. And sometimes, the greatest innovations in warfare come not from generals or scientists or engineers, but from individual soldiers who look at the darkness and decide to learn its language. Because understanding the battlefield is more powerful than any weapon system ever built. The 17 Panthers in Sector 7 Delta learned that lesson too late. By the time they realized someone could actually see them in the darkness, American artillery was already falling. By the time they understood that their perfect concealment had been compromised by a technique everyone said was impossible, they were already burning. They'd thought night vision was futile. They'd thought darkness made them invisible. They'd thought the Americans were fighting blind. They were wrong. Because one man had taught himself to see in the dark, and his legend endures.